The anarcho-capitalist YouTuber TIKHistory recently created a video entitled Hitler's Socialism. The evidence is overwhelming. Now it is clear that the evidence is not overwhelming. It is in fact extremely poor, which is why Tik spends a lot of the video complaining about competent historians who rightly point out that the Third Reich had a capitalist economy. Even Gunter Reimann, the author of the very flawed Vampire Economy, writes that the Third Reich was essentially a capitalist society with private enterprise and private property as the foundation of its economy. Now Tik cannot accept this because his definitions of both socialism and capitalism are utterly ridiculous. He regards any state activity as socialist. Meanwhile, he claims that every private action is capitalist. For example, in his recent video about trade unionism, he claims that non-government unions are capitalist organizations.
A private trade union is a capitalist trade union. A socialized or nationalized trade union is a socialist trade union.
Using this logic, the Russian revolutionaries who were against the Tsarist state were capitalists, since they were anti-state, whilst the Tsarist state was socialist, because it was a state. This is your brain on anarcho-capitalism. I'm not going to spend the whole time talking about his ridiculous definitions. I have already done that in a previous video. Here I'm going to focus on his specific claims. Now let's begin.
The Marxist narrative is that Hitler privatized the industries, crushed the trade unions, and was a capitalist shill. But is this really the case? The process of collectivization of the German people started at the moment the Nazis seized power, and evolved over time. As described in Gunter Reimann's primary source document, The Vampire Economy, and Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction, as well as many others, Nazi party officials and SA members walked into the factories and businesses and took them over from within.
No, the SA did not march into the factories and take them over. Just look at the books that Tik is using here. The Vampire Economy, which states that the Third Reich had a capitalist economy, and Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction. Adam Tooze never indicates that the brown shirts took over the factories. In fact, he states that the capitalists massively increased their power over the workers under the Nazi regime. Quote, "But what was clear was that legitimate authority in the Third Reich proceeded from the top down, ideally from the very top down. And what was also clear was that many leaders of German business thrived in this authoritarian atmosphere. In the sphere of their own firms, they were now the undisputed leaders, empowered as such by the National Labour Law of 1934. Owners and managers alike bought enthusiastically into the rhetoric of Führertum. It meshed all too neatly with the concept of entrepreneurial leadership that had become increasingly fashionable in business circles, as an ideological counterpoint to the interventionist tendencies of trade unions and the Weimar welfare state." End quote. Now that passage highlights why Tik's arguments are so weak on this topic. He not only completely ignores the powerful German business community that benefited a great deal from Hitler's pro-capitalist policies, but also completely ignores the Führer principle, which was a core part of the National Socialist ideology.
It wasn't privatization, as the British Keynesian magazine, known as The Economist, claimed it was in 1936 to describe the policy of the German banks selling shares. Yeah, it had nothing to do with the selling of industries to private interests. Worse, other political commentators in the 1940s describe how the government's centralising of the economy was privatisation, which is clearly not the meaning of the word privatisation we use today.
First of all, The Economist magazine is famous for supporting laissez-faire, free market economics, and is not Keynesian. As for Tik's claim about Nazi privatization being not true privatization, he is wrong again. Privatization is when state-owned industries are sold to private shareholders. Ownership is transferred from the state sector into the private sector. This is what happened to the German banks and many other industries in the Third Reich. To quote Buckheim and Schörner's academic article, The Role of Private Property, in the Nazi economy, the case of industry, quote, in 1936-37, the capital of the Deutsche Bank, the Commerzbank, and the Dresdner Bank, in the possession of the German Reich, was resold to private shareholders, and consequently the state representatives withdrew from the boards of these banks. End quote. The banks were transferred from state ownership to the private sector. This is privatization, whether Tick likes it or not.
And regardless, the actual Nazi policy wasn't privatization. I don't know where the media got the term from, they probably just made it up. But the actual Nazi policy was called Gleichschaltung. This means coordination or synchronization, as in synchronization of the economy and society into the state. Everything was to be merged together as one into the social state. The exact opposite of so-called privatization. Business and professional associations, sports clubs, choral societies, shooting clubs, patriotic associations, and most other forms of organised activity were taken under, or more frequently hastened to place themselves under, National Socialist control in the first months of the Third Reich. There was no more social life. You couldn't even have a bowling club that was not coordinated, was how one inhabitant of Nordheim in Lower Saxony remembered it.
First of all, the policy had nothing to do with economics. Property remained largely in private hands. Furthermore, no one denies that Hitler established a dictatorship where civil organizations were compelled to correspond to the values of the new dictatorial regime. Kershaw, who Tick quoted from, also makes this interesting point. Quote, beyond the former clubs and societies associated with the left-wing parties, which had been dissolved, smashed, or forcibly taken over, there was a good deal of quite voluntary adjustment to the new circumstances. End quote. This tells me that conservative groups found it far easier to adjust to the ideology of Hitler than the left did. The reason for this is because it was a hard right dictatorship. Kershaw also states that whilst leftists were hounded out of their positions, conservatives managed to keep their posts by simply changing their party affiliation. Funny how Tick's eyes missed that section of the book.
Between 30th of January and 14th of July 1933, the Nazis had coordinated all social institutions, apart from the churches and the army, into a vast and still inchoate structure run by themselves. They had purged huge swathes of culture and the arts, the universities and the education system, and almost every other area of German society of everyone who was opposed to them.
This just shows that the Third Reich was a right-wing dictatorship. Many rightist dictators, not just Hitler, boasted about how they purged their opposition and took control of their nations. Some of these dictators are even praised by the Mises Institute, an organisation that Tick adores. Richard Evans points out in The Coming of the Third Reich, quote, the ideas that were current among all German political parties right of the Social Democrats in the early 1930s had a great deal in common with those of the Nazis. These ideas certainly bore enough resemblance to the Nazis for the bulk of the Liberal and Conservative parties' supporters in the Protestant electorate to desert them, at least temporarily, for what looked like a more effective alternative. End quote. To claim that the establishment of a far-right dictatorship, which was supported by the conservatives, is an example of socialism is beyond ridiculous.
Private property rights, as enshrined by Articles 115 and 153 of the Weimar Constitution, were abolished in the Reichstag Fire Decree of 1933. Many historians ignore this part of the Reichstag Fire Decree simply because they can't explain it.
This is a lie. The historians explain it very well. The Reichstag Fire Decree was directed against the communists, who were believed to have been behind the Reichstag fire of 1933. The decree allowed the state to break into the homes and offices of communists in order to drag them to prison. To quote Kershaw, the rounding up of communist deputies and functionaries had already been set in train by Goering during the night in raids carried out with massive brutality. Communists were the main targets, but Social Democrats, trade unionists, and left-wing intellectuals such as Karl Ossietzky were also among those dragged into improvised prisons, often in the cellars of SA or SS local headquarters, and savagely beaten, tortured, and in some cases murdered. Richard Evans also wrote about this. The Reichstag fire decree was launched amidst a barrage of propaganda in which Goering and the Nazi leadership painted a drastic picture of an imminent German Bolshevik revolution, accompanied by outrages and atrocities of every kind. The propaganda had its effect. Ordinary middle-class citizens, like Louise Somitz, shuddered to think of the fate that Germany had so narrowly escaped, and were impressed by the proofs of the dastardly communist plot that Goering provided by the hundredweight." End quote. The Reichstag fire decree was directed against the communists and supported by the political right. Conservatives celebrated the mass arrest and murder of German leftists, claiming that Hitler saved Germany from communism. This decree did not result in large-scale nationalization and the establishment of a communal society. Capitalism was kept firmly in its place. In fact, almost a month after the Reichstag fire decree, Hitler stated before the Reichstag, quote, "In principle, the government will not protect the economic interests of the German people by the circuitous method of an economic bureaucracy to be organized by the state, but by the utmost furtherance of private initiative and by the recognition of the rights of property." End quote. So far from being an attack on capitalism, this action was seen as a defense against the communists. It should be noted that one of the leading figures of the Mises Institute, George Reisman, celebrated similar actions implemented by other right-wing dictatorships. Quote, "People have an absolute right to rise up and defend their lives, liberty, and property against a communist takeover. In the process, they cannot be expected to make the distinctions present in a judicial process. They must act quickly and decisively to remove what threatens them. That is the nature of war. The fate of innocent bystanders, largely those who cannot be readily distinguished from the enemy, is the responsibility of the communists." End quote. That's right, Tick. The fascist imbeciles at the Mises Institute agree with their like-minded bedfellows, the Nazis, that judicial process must be suspended in order to fight the communists. So the Reichstag fire decree and its results was simply an example of violent anti-communism in action, typical of policies implemented by rightist dictatorships across the world.
My question to them is, why didn't the Jews and others sue the Nazis for stealing their property from them?
Because Jews did not have legal rights in the Third Reich. Tick, in a disgusting manner, has presented the persecution of Jews as an anti-capitalist endeavour, forgetting that Jewish workers, Jewish musicians, Jewish university professors, Jewish lawyers, Jewish sports stars, Jewish soldiers and Jewish public servants were also discriminated against, being dismissed from their employment. They could not sue their employers or the state either. It should be noted that the seizure of Jewish property had nothing to do with creating a socialist economy, since the property was largely bought out by non-Jewish capitalists, at a tiny fraction of their original value. To give just one example, the famous car designer Ferdinand Porsche used Aryanization to deprive his Jewish business partner, Adolf Rosenberger, of his shares in the company. This was not changing the economic system. This was a deeply anti-Semitic policy to force Jews out of all economic life in Germany, whether they be workers or business owners. The capitalist system remained in place.
The Nazis viewed private property as conditional on its use, not as a fundamental right. If the property was not being used to further Nazi goals, it could be nationalised. So, the industries and businesses were nationalised.
There it is, folks, an example of Tick's blatant dishonesty. Timon, whose views have largely been debunked by better economists and historians, did not say that the Nazis nationalised all industry. He simply said they could. However, they did not. Quote, "Available sources make perfectly clear that the Nazi regime did not want at all a German economy with public ownership of many or all enterprises. Therefore, it generally had no intention whatsoever of nationalizing private firms or creating state firms. On the contrary, the reprivatization of enterprises was furthered whenever possible." End quote. Tich is being willfully dishonest to claim that all industry was nationalized by the Nazis. He is lying to you.
The people who ran the industries were Nazis. Every member of the executive branches of IG Farben were members of the Nazi Party, except the one who was a Swiss national and therefore exempt.
Again, Tich is being misleading here. The executives of IG Farben joined the Nazis after Hitler came to power. Many of the executives of IG Farben, such as the CAO, Hermann Schmitz, had been with the company since its formation in 1925. He was not some former brown shirt, but actually a leading player in the chemical industry long before Hitler came to power.
And heavy social regulations were imposed on every industry, including regulations on the hiring and firing of workers, working hours, working habits, accidents, wages, vacation time, etc.
First of all, every single capitalist nation has regulations when it comes to working hours, holiday pay, who they can hire, etc. Regulated capitalist economies are not socialist, especially if the regulation ends up benefiting the capitalist class economically at the expense of the working class, which is what happened in the Third Reich. For example, the workers' share of the national income fell from 56.9% in the Depression year of 1932 to 53.6% in 1938. This is startling because the unemployment rate had drastically been reduced and working hours had been extended. What is even more significant is that the national income from capital and business rose from 17.4% to 26.6%. This shows that the regulations introduced by the NSDAP favoured the capitalist class, whether Tich likes it or not.
If the leaders refused to cooperate, the factories that they supposedly owned were taken off them. Professor Juncker of the Junkers Airplane Factory was the first to be thrown out of his own business as a result, but he wasn't the only one.
No one denies that those who openly disobeyed the dictatorship were harshly punished. That was true for everyone, whether they be workers, capitalists, state officials, members of the military, and even members of the party. Hugo Junkers made the mistake of disagreeing with the Air Ministry about rearmament and was punished severely as a result. And I have to be honest, there was heavy state intervention in the aircraft industry. In 1932, the German aircraft industry employed 3,200 people and produced around 100 aircraft a year. Less than 10 years later, the industry employed at least 250,000 people and was producing more than 10,000 aircraft a year. A massive increase in production and manpower that was financed and directed by the state. However, as Tooze notes, the building up of the Air Force also led to a surge of private firms joining the industry. Companies such as Voss and Bohm, Flick AG, and Henschel and Sons, all becoming major aircraft builders. It was also startling that by 1938 there were several companies that specialized in aircraft building, the state-owned Junkers as well as the private Misuse, that were in the top 20 of all Germany's corporations. Back in 1932, not one of them would have made the top 500. Junkers remained the only state aircraft company and has been classed by Buchheim and Schörner as the exception of the rule. The clear aim of Nazi policy was to quickly build up the size and power of the German Air Force. If the market was unable to do this, they would heavily intervene. Now the question is, was this a socialist policy or a free market capitalist policy? It was neither. It was an example of Dirigisme capitalism in action, where the state intervenes into the market in order to accomplish a specific goal. Such a policy approach was used heavily by capitalist South Korea when it was building up its industrial base, as well as Imperial and post-war Japan. Germany could clearly not win a war if the aircraft industry remained extremely tiny, which is why they were not willing to argue with Mr. Junkers.
Those industries that had their former owners removed, expropriated, were then sold to individuals in the Nazi Party, who then ran them on behalf of the Nazi Party. In other words, they were nationalised. This fact is pointed out by Bells Against the Mainstream, a text that is often used by Marxists to prove that it was privatization. Except it doesn't. It accidentally proves the exact opposite, if only they had actually bothered to read it.
Tik is being blatantly dishonest here. He has deliberately left out the first half of the paragraph in order to deceive his audience. Quote, although modern economic literature usually ignores the fact the Nazi government in 1930s Germany undertook a wide-scale privatization policy. The government sold public ownership in several state-owned firms in different sectors. In addition, delivery of some public services previously produced by the public sector was transferred to the private sector, mainly to organizations within the Nazi Party. So Bao does not state that all industries were sold off to the Nazi Party. That is a lie. Bao claims that welfare organizations and public services that were privatized mainly went to organizations within the party. This does not cover banks, shipyards, shipping lines, railways, mining, and steel industries that were sold off. So Tik here is trying to deceive you, something he tries to do throughout the video. It should be noted that Tik ignores the massive elephant in the room, the fact that the Third Reich economy remained overwhelmingly in private hands. According to Franz Neumann, in 1937, the nominal capital of German joint stock and limited liability compounds, aka the private sector, was 23,300 million. By contrast, the nominal capital of the state sector during this time was a mere 1,774 million. This was 4 years after Tik claims that Hitler abolished private property, which was clearly a lie. The economy cannot even be described as a mixed economy. It was overwhelmingly private. Since this is the case, it cannot possibly be considered a socialist economy, which requires at the very base level common ownership of the means of production. Even if we ignore the growth of the private sector between 1937 and 1939 and add the Hermann Göring works, which had a nominal capital of 1,045,500,000 on its own in 1939, the economy was still overwhelmingly in capitalist hands. As it turns out, Hitler and his followers fundamentally believed in the importance of private property and profits.
Both governments, Nazi and Soviet, reorganized industry into larger units, ostensibly to increase state control over economic activity. The Nazis reorganized industry into 13 administrative groups with a large number of subgroups to create a private hierarchy for state control.
First of all, I would like to know what these 13 administrative groups were. Secondly, forming cartels of private companies is not socialism. In fact, it is a policy that is very good for big business. In some capitalist countries, cartels are actually forbidden because it gives large businesses an unfair advantage over small ones. Finally, it is laughable that this private hierarchy of state control, with big businesses at the top, can be described as socialism. It is utterly absurd.
The state therefore could direct the firm's activities without acquiring direct ownership of enterprises. The pre-existing tendency to form cartels was encouraged to eliminate competition that would destabilize prices.
While small businesses were crushed in favour of big ones under this version of capitalism, competition still very much existed. To quote Franz Neumann, "At this stage we need only show that markets and competition have by no means been abolished. The conflicts are reproduced on a higher level, and the incentives of competition remain operative. The defeat of Thyssen is a major example. His economic decline was an accomplished fact long before his flight from Germany, which in reality may have been merely the consequence of his defeat by his competitors. Friedrich Flick and the Goering Combine. End quote. The lie that capitalists were merely managers is also ridiculous. Quote, Otto Wolff, Friedrich Flick and Gunther Quandt are not managers, but powerful capitalists. They are not rentiers who at the end of the year cut the dividend coupons of their stock certificates and cash their dividends, nor are the managers themselves simply managers, that is, salaried employees. They have long ago assumed the role of capitalists proper, investing their savings in shares and often speculating with the funds of their own corporations, thereby strengthening their personal financial power within them. End quote.
Practice, the Reichsbank and the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs had no intention of allowing the radical activists of the SA, the shop floor militants of the Nazi Party, or Gauleiter commissioners to dictate the course of events. Under the slogan of the strong state, the ministerial bureaucracy fashioned a new national structure of economic regulation. We worked and governed with incredible elan. We really ruled. For the bureaucrats of the ministry, the contrast to the Weimar Republic was stark. Party chatter in the Reichstag was no longer heard. The language of the bureaucracy was rid of the paralysing formula. Technically right, but politically impossible.
Not one of these quotes helped Tick's arguments at all. Two's quote actually does the opposite, claiming that the radical activists of the SA were ignored, as were those who were on the shop floor of the workplace. This shows that those at the ministry and the central bank were more keen on pursuing a pro-capitalist direction when it came to rearmament, and they had Hitler's blessing. Furthermore, Hitler's Reich economic minister, Hjalmar Schacht, was an ardent capitalist who had strong links to German big business. In fact, it was Schacht who really connected Hitler to the industrialists in the 1930s.
Manufacturers in Germany were panic-stricken when they heard of the experiences of some industrialists who were more or less expropriated by the state. These industrialists were visited by state auditors who had strict orders to examine the balance sheets and all booking entries of the company or individual businessman for the preceding 2, 3 or more years until some error or false entry was found. The slightest formal mistake was punished with tremendous penalties. A fine of millions of marks was imposed for a single bookkeeping error. Obviously, the examination of the books was simply a pretext for partial expropriation of the private capitalist with a view to complete expropriation and seizure of the desired property later.
One of the great weaknesses of Riemann's book is that it really lacks specifics. For example, from the passage Tick has just read, you have no idea what industrialist Riemann was talking about. Is he talking about small businesses, which were crushed in favour of big business, or large industries, who, by and large, thrived under Hitler's version of capitalism? As pointed out by Franz Neumann, the Third Reich was a capitalist economy, where the means of production were largely held in private hands. Of course, Gunter Riemann largely agrees with this assessment, so we cannot attack him too much. There was no large-scale expropriation, not even when the war was going terribly for the Third Reich.
The owner of the property was helpless, since under National Socialism there is no longer an independent judiciary that protects the property rights of private citizens against the state. The authoritarian state has made it a principle that private property is no longer sacred.
As I said before, the state certainly had the power to nationalise all industry, as all states do. However, the Nazis did not nationalise industry. In fact, they preferred private ownership. Saying that they could have nationalised industry, but chose not to, does not help Tick's argument, which was already extremely weak to begin with. In fact, it shows that Hitler was indeed committed to the concept of private property, which he stated on many occasions. It is undeniable that the Third Reich had a capitalist economy. Undeniable.
Marxists claim that Hitler crushed the trade unions, which somehow proves that he wasn't a socialist, even though Lenin did the exact same thing.
This is an extremely dishonest comparison. For one, the Third Reich had a powerful business community, since it was a capitalist state, so if the workers' unions were crushed, it would benefit that class. And it did. workers' share of the income fell, whilst profits skyrocketed. So yes, crushing trade unions, squeezing workers' wages, whilst presiding over a massive profit surge sounds pretty pro-capitalist to me.
Everyone who worked in a factory, be they employers or employees, had to be a member of the DAF, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, or German Labour Front. This was the nationalised trade union of the Third Reich that had a whopping 32 million members in 1938, making this one of the biggest trade unions in history. Any private union that refused to be nationalised into the DAF was crushed. But that isn't proof of Hitler's capitalism, it's proof that he socialised the unions just like Lenin did. There were no private unions in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they were all nationalised into the state. And yet, this nationalised union is simply dismissed by many Marxist historians as a shill for the capitalist elite. However, the Nazi Party itself only had 8.5 million members at its peak. So for the German Labour Front to have 32 million members, 42% of the entire German population, it's a clear indication that this was an important part of the National Socialist movement and shouldn't just be ignored.
Again, Tick is being utterly dishonest here. First of all, notice the language he uses. He is pretending that trade unions, formed by workers, are private organisations comparable to private companies. The truth is that they tend to be socialist organisations, where workers join together to fight for better pay and conditions. Furthermore, Tick attempts to brush aside the fact that employers were also members of the German Labour Front. This is an extremely important aspect that he virtually pays no attention to. Why? Because it blows his arguments out of the water. For example, a famous member of the German Labour Front was Hugo Boss, a capitalist whose company massively increased in size under Hitler's pro-capitalist policies. Hardly a striking worker, is he? I think Tick is being very slimy here.
Private property rights abolished under the new National Socialist regulations enforced by the DAF. The concepts of employers and employees were done away with, being replaced with the terms leaders and followers. And while some followers did complain about the new system, saying it was benefiting the leaders at the expense of the followers, their leaders also complained about the new system.
The German labour order law introduced by the National Socialists is rightly considered to be a major victory for the capitalist class, as Richard Evans says, quote, "The new system of industrial relations represented a major victory for the employers, backed by Hitler and the Nazi leadership, who badly needed the cooperation of industry in their drive to rearm," end quote. So from this we can see that the employer clearly had the advantage over the worker. Under the German Labour Order Act of 1934, it clearly states that the leader, the capitalist entrepreneur, decides all company matters and his followers must be loyal to him. It does add that the leader has a responsibility to his followers, aka noblesse oblige, as a nobleman has to his serfs. So the capitalist employers clearly had the role of Führer in his factory, and the workers had to obey him without question. Now you know why Tick avoided actually looking at the law, because it greatly damages his argument. He does not have a leg to stand on. But let's see his evidence to the contrary.
New system.
Yes, I am the leader in my factory. My workers are my followers, but I am no longer a manager. I cannot decide what is allowed or forbidden in my own factory. There have been cases where managers were removed by the Party of Labour trustees and replaced by commissars. However, by the same token, some leaders and followers also embraced the new order, as it reminded them of the previous war. As plant leader, Ludwig Hermann from Höchst perceived himself as an officer and his followers as his soldiers. Hermann recognised the community spirit of the trenches of the First World War again in the national community Volksgemeinschaft of the Nazi regime, as did other industrialists and managers.
So here Tick gives us two examples, one from so-called Herr AZ and the other from Ludwig Hermann from the Hoist Company, which was part of the IG Farben Combine. The individual that gives a negative opinion, Herr AZ, is anonymous. We have no idea who he is, nor what company he represents. The other, Ludwig Hermann, gives a positive account, seeing himself as a commanding officer. Ludwig Hermann's account confirms what Evans, Scherer, Toos and others have said, that under National Socialist labour law, the capitalist and his representatives were clearly above the workers in the hierarchy, since it was a capitalist economy. Indeed, soldiers are supposed to obey their commanding officers without question. Disobeying an order is considered to be a disciplinary offence. As for the labour trustees and the associated courts of honour, Evans writes, quote, "In fact, the courts of honour were virtually a dead letter. Only 516 cases were brought before them in 1934 to 36, mostly concerning the physical abuse of apprentices by master artisans. They might have looked fair and just on paper, but in practice they had little real effect." End quote. The courts of honour seem to only target small businessmen who the Nazis chose to make examples of, mostly small craftsmen, artisans who only had a small number of apprentices. So was Herr AZ a shoemaker, a stonemason, an artist, or a tiny retailer? We have no idea, which makes his claims extremely hard to verify. A major weakness with Gunter Ryman's book. A worthy question to ask is, what was life for workers in a factory in Nazi Germany? To quote Evans again, in factories and workplaces, officials of the Labour Front, the employers, the foremen, and the Nazi security service took over the functions of the block warden. Those workers who did not toe the line were singled out for discriminatory treatment, denial of promotion, transfer to less congenial duties, or even dismissal. "You couldn't say anything," recalled one worker in the Krupp engineering factory. Later, "The foreman was always standing behind you. Nobody could risk it. The Nazi terror machine reached down even to the smallest units of everyday life and daily work." End quote. It will not surprise you that over 700 Krupp workers were sent to concentration camps during this time, before the war. 700 in just one company. The factory owner was the Führer of his factory. This is the end of part 1. Now the only reason why I chose to split this video is because the current PC that I am on is driving me completely mad, crashing, freezing every 5 minutes. My new computer arrived a month ago and I'm looking forward to continuing making videos on that. On this PC it has become too frustrating. But I must say that I'm quite disgusted at TIKH's conduct. He not only misuses sources, but misrepresents the views of mainstream historians. His claim that the historians could not explain the Reichstag fire decree was an outright lie, since he was the one omitting important information. Since this fool is so deceitful, making a response video to him is a long and draining process. I still have to get to his part on Henry Ashby Turner's book, German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler, which TIKH uses extensively. By the way, in the book, Turner states that Hitler was an anti-socialist, out of conviction, which debunks TIKH's central argument. TIKH's claim that every state action should be counted as socialist is a distortion of history, especially when his god Ludwig von Mises was far more a statist than the wicked Karl Marx. Mises was a member of a fascist party, who mostly got cushy government jobs. Marx died stateless. And finally, we can conclude that the Third Reich was a far-right, anti-communist regime which had a capitalist economic system. The claim that an economy where more than 80% of the means of production were in private capitalist hands is a socialist economy is beyond deceitful and moronic. An economy where the capitalists or the profit saw whilst workers' wages stagnated. An economy where the income share of the capitalist class massively increased. The Third Reich was a capitalist state, which aligned perfectly with Hitler's ideology. TIKH can scream not true capitalism all he wants, but that will never be able to overturn these facts.